Miller House had always been the talk of the town, a crumbling Victorian mansion at the end of Old Maple Lane. Its grand facade, once majestic, now stood as a decaying relic, with ivy crawling up its sides and broken windows staring like hollow eyes. It had been abandoned for decades, and local legends spoke of its haunted past. Despite the rumors, I had always been a skeptic, believing that the stories were nothing more than local folklore. That is, until one fateful night when I decided to investigate the mansion myself. I had recently moved to the area and was eager to explore the local mysteries. The Miller House intrigued me, and with a keen interest in paranormal phenomena, I decided it was time to put the legends to the test. Armed with a flashlight, a voice recorder, and a camera, I ventured out on a crisp autumn evening, determined to debunk the myths once and for all. As I approached the mansion, the full moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape. The mansion's once grand entrance was now overgrown with weeds, and the front door hung askew on its hinges. I hesitated for a moment, feeling a shiver of apprehension, but my curiosity drove me forward. The interior of the house was just as I had imagined: dust-covered furniture, cobwebs draping from the chandeliers, and a musty smell that spoke of years of neglect. I started my investigation in the foyer, where I set up my camera to record any unusual activity. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I moved cautiously through the rooms, each step echoing through the empty house. I began by recording EVP, electronic voice phenomena, sessions in various rooms, asking questions about the history of the house and its previous occupants. At first, there was nothing but the sound of my own voice and the occasional groan of the old house settling. I moved to the library, a room with rows of dusty books and a large, ornate fireplace. It was in the library that I first experienced something unsettling. As I reviewed the footage, a shadowy figure appeared in the background of one of the shots, moving quickly across the frame before disappearing. I was startled but tried to remain rational. The figure could have been a trick of the light or a camera glitch. Undeterred, I continued my investigation, moving to the second floor. The hallway was lined with old, faded portraits of stern-looking individuals who seemed to watch me as I walked. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The house felt colder and more oppressive as I made my way to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. Inside the bedroom, I set up my equipment and began another EVP session. As I asked questions about the inhabitants of the house, a sudden, loud bang echoed through the room. I jumped, my flashlight casting erratic shadows on the walls. The noise seemed to come from the attic, a space I hadn't yet explored. My heart raced as I decided to investigate further. The attic stairs were narrow and steep, and the air grew colder with each step I took. When I reached the top, I found myself in a dimly lit space cluttered with old trunks and forgotten belongings. The attic was filled with a strange, almost palpable sense of dread. I began to feel like I was being watched. I started recording again, asking questions into the darkness. Suddenly, I heard a soft whisper, almost too quiet to catch. I turned around, but the attic remained empty. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. I could make out a few words: "Help us," and "Leave," but they were fragmented and indistinct. As I reviewed the audio recordings, I noticed something even more disturbing: a series of low, guttural growls interspersed with the whispers. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room with an unsettling presence. I could no longer deny that something unusual was happening. I decided to leave the attic, but as I turned to descend the stairs, the door to the attic slammed shut with a thunderous bang. Panic surged through me as I tried to open the door, but it was locked tight. The whispers turned into frantic, pleading voices, and the temperature plummeted even further. In a state of terror, I pounded on the door, shouting for help. The voices grew louder, more desperate, and the shadows in the attic seemed to writhe and twist. I could see vague, ghostly figures moving in the corner of my vision, their faces twisted in anguish. Finally, with a burst of adrenaline, I managed to force the door open. I bolted down the stairs, the whispers and growls still echoing in my ears. I grabbed my equipment and rushed out of the mansion, my heart pounding, my mind racing. Once outside, I glanced back at the Miller house. It loomed in the moonlight, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. I felt a profound sense of relief as I made my way to safety, the oppressive atmosphere of the house lifting as I left its confines. In the days that followed, I reviewed my recordings and photographs. The evidence was both fascinating and horrifying: shadowy figures, inexplicable noises, and the disturbing presence of unseen entities. The Miller house had proven to be more than just a relic of the past. It was a place where the echoes of the past lingered, a haunting reminder of the supernatural. Though I continued my research into paranormal phenomena, I never returned to Miller house. The experience had left me deeply shaken, and the whispers and growls of that night remained etched in my memory. The mansion stood as a chilling testament to the unknown, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin and easily breached. I had always been drawn to the eerie and unexplained, so when I heard about the old Anderson estate on the outskirts of town, my curiosity was piqued. The mansion, a grand but dilapidated structure, had been abandoned for over 30 years. It was said to be haunted by the spirits of its former inhabitants, who had met tragic ends under mysterious circumstances. The stories of eerie apparitions and strange occurrences intrigued me, and one evening, I decided to investigate the estate for myself. It was a crisp autumn night when I arrived at the estate. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the overgrown lawn. The mansion's once majestic facade was now covered in ivy, with broken windows and a sagging roof that gave it a foreboding appearance. I could feel a chill in the air, and a sense of unease settled over me as I approached the front door. Armed with a flashlight, a voice recorder, and a camera, I made my way inside. The interior was just as I had imagined: dust-covered furniture, cobwebs hanging from the chandeliers, and an oppressive silence that filled the air. The smell of mildew and decay was overpowering, and each step I took echoed through the empty halls. I started my investigation in the grand foyer, where I set up my camera and began recording. The mansion was unnervingly quiet, the only sounds being the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant rustling of leaves. I asked questions into the darkness, hoping to capture any paranormal responses. As I moved through the house, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. I could feel an inexplicable presence watching me, and the temperature seemed to drop noticeably in certain rooms. I continued to record and photograph, documenting everything I could. It was in the library where the true horror began. The room was lined with old books and had a large, ornate fireplace. I set up my equipment and began another EVP, electronic voice phenomena, session, asking questions about the history of the estate and its former occupants. As I reviewed the footage, I noticed something unsettling: shadowy figures darting across the room in the background of my recordings. The shadows were fleeting and indistinct, but they moved with an unsettling intelligence, almost as if they were aware of my presence. I reviewed the footage multiple times, but the figures remained just out of reach, their movements quick and erratic. I decided to investigate further, moving to the second floor. The hallway was lined with faded portraits of the Anderson family, their eyes seeming to follow me as I walked. The temperature continued to drop, and I felt an increasing sense of dread as I approached a small bedroom at the end of the hall. Inside the bedroom, I set up my equipment and began another EVP session. The room was colder than the others, and the air felt heavy with an unseen weight. As I asked questions, a sudden, sharp noise echoed through the room, like a door slamming shut. I jumped, my flashlight flickering as I turned to look. The bedroom door had swung open slightly, and the shadows in the room seemed to writhe and shift. I felt a cold breeze, and the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath misting in front of me, and the shadows on the walls began to move more aggressively. The whispers started then, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from all directions. They grew louder and more insistent, merging into a chaotic chorus of murmurs. The shadows on the walls twisted into grotesque shapes, their forms shifting and elongating as if they were alive. In a state of terror, I grabbed my flashlight and camera, trying to document the phenomenon. The shadows seemed to take on more defined shapes, dark, twisted figures with hollow eyes that stared at me from the darkness. The whispers turned into guttural, unintelligible growls, and the temperature continued to plummet. Desperate to leave, I stumbled out of the bedroom and down the hall. The shadows followed me, their movement growing more frenetic. The air was thick with a palpable sense of menace, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. I could feel a cold hand grasping at my shoulder, and I turned to see nothing but darkness. Finally, I reached the staircase and raced down, the shadows closing in around me. The mansion seemed to close in, its walls bending and warping as if the very structure was alive. I reached the front door, but it wouldn't open. The whispers and growls were overwhelming, and the shadows seemed to press in from all sides. With a burst of adrenaline, I managed to force the door open and fled into the night. The cold air was a welcome relief as I made my way back to my car. I glanced back at the mansion, its dark silhouette looming in the moonlight. The shadows seemed to retreat, but the sense of dread remained. In the days that followed, I reviewed my recordings and photographs. The footage was both fascinating and terrifying, shadowy figures, inexplicable movements, and the chilling whispers that had filled the mansion. The Anderson estate had proven to be more than just an old house, it was a place where the shadows seemed to have a life of their own, a haunting reminder of the unknown. Though I continued to explore paranormal phenomena, I never returned to the Anderson estate. The experience had left me deeply shaken, and the whispers and shifting shadows of that night lingered in my mind. The mansion stood as a dark and foreboding reminder of the supernatural, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead were disturbingly thin. It was a night like any other when I received the call from my old friend, Mark, who now lived in a small, secluded town nestled in the mountains. He was clearly distressed and implored me to come over, mentioning that something unsettling had happened in his home. Mark was a rational man, skeptical of anything supernatural, so his fear was palpable and immediately concerning. The drive to Mark's house took longer than expected due to the winding mountain roads and heavy fog that seemed to cling to every corner of the landscape. When I finally arrived, the house looked as though it had been pulled from an old ghost story, an old, creaky Victorian with an overgrown garden and darkened windows. Mark met me at the door, his face pale and lined with worry. We went inside, and Mark wasted no time explaining the situation. It began a few weeks ago, he said, with the appearance of an old lantern that had been left on the front porch. The lantern was rusted and old, with a flickering flame that seemed to burn without a proper source of fuel. Mark had dismissed it initially as a prank or a harmless mistake by a neighbor, but the disturbances soon escalated. The first odd occurrence was the mysterious disappearance of items around the house. Objects like picture frames, books, and even pieces of furniture seemed to vanish only to reappear in different locations. Mark thought he might be losing his mind, but he wasn't alone. His dog, a usually calm golden retriever named Bailey, had been acting erratically, growling at unseen things and refusing to enter certain rooms. Things took a darker turn when Mark began to hear whispers in the dead of night, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He tried to ignore them, attributing them to the house settling or his imagination running wild. However, the whispers grew more insistent, and he started seeing shadowy figures moving in the periphery of his vision. The final straw was the night before I arrived. Mark had woken to the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs and found the lantern lit once more, its light casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The lantern had been placed in the middle of the living room, even though Mark had specifically put it away in the attic. The sight of it filled him with an irrational fear, and he begged me to come and help him figure out what was going on. I agreed to stay the night, hoping that my presence would provide some comfort and help Mark get to the bottom of the mystery. We began by investigating the attic where the lantern had been stored. The attic was a cluttered mess of old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs. It was clear that the place hadn't been touched in years. As we rummaged through the attic, Mark pointed out a series of old photographs that had been scattered across a dusty table. They were black and white images of people who seemed oddly familiar, but none of them appeared to be recent. Among them was a photograph of a man holding the exact lantern that had been appearing in Mark's home. The man looked stern and sad, and the lantern was identical to the one on the porch. While we examined the photograph, Bailey began to bark frantically from the hallway. His barks were desperate, almost pleading. Mark and I hurried out of the attic and down to the main floor, where Bailey was standing in front of the living room, his eyes fixed on the flickering lantern that now stood on the coffee table, even though we had just put it away in the attic. The atmosphere in the house had grown colder, and the whispers had returned, louder and more insistent. The voices seemed to echo off the walls, their tone growing more frantic. I decided to set up my recording equipment to capture any anomalies and conducted an EVP session in the living room. As I asked questions into the darkness, the whispers intensified, blending into a chorus of disembodied voices. The lantern's light began to flicker wildly, casting long, erratic shadows that twisted and contorted on the walls. Mark's anxiety was palpable, and Bailey's barking grew more frantic. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into a coherent message, barely audible but distinct: "Help us. Trapped. Light the way." The words were chilling, and the tone of the voices was a mix of anguish and desperation. We decided to investigate the source of the message. Mark led me to a small, hidden door behind a bookcase that he had never noticed before. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow, dark passageway. With the lantern in hand, we made our way down the passage, our footsteps echoing in the tight corridor. At the end of the passage was a small, dusty room with a single, ancient chest in the center. The chest was locked, but the lantern's light seemed to focus on it as if guiding us. We pried open the chest and discovered a collection of old letters and personal belongings, along with a diary belonging to the man in the photograph. The diary recounted the life of a man named Thomas Anderson, who had lived in the house a century ago. He wrote about a tragic event where his family had been lost in a terrible accident, leaving him alone and heartbroken. The lantern, it seemed, was a symbol of his hope and desperation to guide his lost loved ones. The final entry was heart-wrenching, a plea for someone to help him find peace and to finally let go of his pain. It became clear that the spirits in the house were those of his family, trapped in a cycle of torment and seeking release. We performed a small ritual based on the diary's instructions to help Thomas find peace and guide his spirit to the afterlife. The lantern's light grew steadier and then extinguished itself, the oppressive atmosphere lifting from the house. The following morning, Mark and I sat in the now quiet living room. Bailey had calmed down, and the house felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Mark was relieved, and the disturbing phenomena ceased. We had managed to help the spirits find peace, and the lantern's haunting presence had finally come to an end. Though I left the house with a sense of accomplishment, the experience remained etched in my memory. The lantern had been a beacon of both hope and despair, and our encounter with the supernatural had revealed a poignant and tragic story of loss and redemption. The Anderson estate remained a testament to the unresolved grief of the past, but it was now a place where the restless spirits had finally found their way to the light. Ravenwood Manor had always been a place of local legend. Situated on the outskirts of a small, rural town, the grand estate had fallen into disrepair after a series of tragic events in the 1950s. The stories of its haunted past were well known among the townsfolk: ghostly apparitions, inexplicable noises, and strange occurrences that defied rational explanation. Despite these tales, I had always been a skeptic, convinced that the manor's reputation was nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination. That skepticism was put to the test one fateful evening when I, a paranormal investigator by hobby, decided to spend the night in Ravenwood Manor. Armed with state-of-the-art equipment, digital voice recorders, thermal cameras, and motion sensors, I was determined to either debunk the myths or uncover the truth behind the manor's haunted reputation. The approach to Ravenwood Manor was as eerie as one might expect. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the once grand entrance was now a shadow of its former self, with crumbling pillars and a dilapidated facade. The evening was unseasonably cold, and a heavy fog began to roll in, adding to the already ominous atmosphere. I entered the manor through the front door, which creaked open with a groan that echoed through the empty halls. The interior was a labyrinth of decaying opulence, faded wallpaper, dusty chandeliers, and moth-eaten furniture that spoke of better times now long gone. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of neglect. I began my investigation in the grand ballroom, the centerpiece of the manor. It was an expansive room with a high ceiling and a large, ornate mirror that reflected the dim light of my flashlight. I set up my equipment and started an EVP, electronic voice phenomena, session, asking questions about the manor's past and its former inhabitants. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the sound of my own voice and the occasional creak of the house settling. But as the hours passed, strange things began to happen. The temperature dropped sharply, and my breath misted in the cold air. The motion sensors started to go off intermittently, but each time I checked, there was no visible movement. As I reviewed my recordings, I heard a faint whispering in the background. It was barely audible, but the words were clear enough: "Help us. Trapped." The voice was cold and desperate, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I decided to explore the second floor, where many of the townsfolk claimed the most activity occurred. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended, and the air grew colder with each step. I set up my equipment in a large bedroom that had once belonged to the manor's owner, Charles Ravenwood. The bedroom was decorated in a style reminiscent of a bygone era, with a large, four-poster bed and heavy drapes. As I began another EVP session, I noticed that the temperature in the room dropped even further, and the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, flickering and shifting in the corners of the room. The whispers returned, growing louder and more coherent. I could make out a few words: "Not safe. Escape. Danger." The voices seemed to be pleading, their tone tinged with fear. I continued to record, trying to capture as much evidence as possible. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from the hallway. I rushed out of the bedroom and found a large mirror lying shattered on the floor. The mirror had been hanging on the wall just moments before, and its sudden fall was inexplicable. I checked my equipment, but everything seemed to be in order. The room felt colder, and the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier. I decided to investigate the source of the commotion. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed that the shadows seemed to move more aggressively, stretching and curling around the corners of the rooms. The whispers grew louder, merging into a chorus of desperate voices. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. In one of the back rooms, I discovered a hidden door behind a large bookcase. The door creaked open to reveal a small, dark space that appeared to be a forgotten study or library. Inside, I found a series of old journals and letters, detailing the tragic history of the Ravenwood family. The journals recounted a series of events that had led to the manor's downfall. Charles Ravenwood, the estate's owner, had been involved in a series of questionable financial dealings. When the truth came to light, he and his family were ostracized and their wealth stripped away. In a fit of desperation, Charles had sealed himself and his family in the manor, where they perished in isolation and despair. The letters revealed that the family had been trying to contact anyone who could help them, but their cries for help had gone unanswered. It seemed that the spirits of the Ravenwood family were still trapped in the manor, bound by their tragic end and their desperate pleas for rescue. As I read the final entries, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and a cold breeze swept through the space. The whispers grew louder, almost overwhelming. The shadows in the room seemed to close in around me, their forms dark and menacing. In a final attempt to help, I performed a ritual based on the instructions in the journals, hoping to release the trapped spirits from their torment. As I completed the ritual, the temperature began to normalize, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The whispers faded, and the shadows receded, leaving the room calm and peaceful. I spent the rest of the night documenting the changes and reviewing my recordings. The evidence of paranormal activity was undeniable, but the sense of relief and closure for the Ravenwood family was palpable. The manor, once a place of fear and despair, felt lighter and more serene. As I left Ravenwood Manor, the first light of dawn was breaking through the fog. The estate stood as a haunting reminder of the past, but its spirits had finally found peace. My experience at Ravenwood Manor had changed my perspective on the paranormal, revealing the profound impact of unresolved grief and the importance of helping those who are trapped between worlds.